Hello, hello. Welcome to March 2019. We are almost through the first quarter of the year. It feels like Christmas was just not that long ago, and we were talking about year-end and plans for the first month of the year and making those resolutions that we always make at the beginning of the year. But now we're already into March and getting ready to close out the third quarter. And I'm excited, as always, to be here with you for this evening's episode of HR in the Dark, the video podcast that exposes the dark side of HR. And my name is Stephanie Lomax. I am your host for the podcast and also CEO and HR strategist for HR Pro for You. We are a consulting firm that works in the realm of human resources, helping businesses to embrace HR so that as they grow, we focus on small businesses. So as they grow, they have the proper foundation that they need. They have a legally compliant, scalable organization in terms of HR that will allow them to continue to grow and succeed in the business in which they decided to start. So I am glad to be here with you this evening. We are talking today about how employees are set up to fail by their employers. And honestly, even though the attitude may be, good luck with that, oftentimes it happens very unintentionally, and we're going to talk about how that cycle happens unintentionally tonight. And also just want to give you a quick heads up. I have a couple of exciting announcements at the end of the podcast, so make sure you stick with me through this to get those great announcements at the end of the podcast. So again, good luck with that, right? This is March. It's St. Patrick's Day, the luck of the Irish and all that good stuff if you celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And I wanted to focus on how it is that employers tend to, unintentionally again, set their employees up to fail. Many times it starts out very... it's one little teeny thing that happens. And then as a result of that one teeny thing, these tremendous events start to kind of spiral into an unfortunate downward spiral, and the employee is unable to recover. And so we're going to talk about what those steps are. And then we're also going to talk about some of the things that employers can do to make sure that they can combat that, so that if they see this syndrome starting to occur, how they can kind of climb out of it, because it is definitely reversible. So let's talk about that. Are employees solely responsible for their success in an organization? Definitely not. They certainly bring a certain set of skills to the table. They interview for, the position, and they expound upon in the interview how they can fulfill those roles and responsibilities, but they're not solely responsible for their success once they get into the organization, nor should they be solely responsible. That takes away the responsibility of the management team and the executive team and those that are responsible for leading the team or the individual. The truth of the matter is, employers are mainly responsible for the success of employees within an organization. What the Harvard Business Review coins this unfortunate syndrome as is called the set up to fail syndrome. There's actually a name for it. It's been around since probably the late 90s, actually. And they have a whole article that they wrote up on this and did some research on how this actually happens. And it's really quite interesting. Managers are often complicit in the failure of their employees and the lack of their success in this set up to fail syndrome. And here is what typically happens. I'm going to kind of read through this. It's a no harm intended. A relationship spirals from bad to worse. So first, what happens is, before the syndrome even kicks in, the boss and the subordinate, the manager, the employee, are typically engaged in a relatively positive relationship. They have or at least a neutral relationship, right? So there's no tension kind of going into this downward spiral syndrome initially. Then the trigger event is that the employee makes a mistake. They miss a deadline, they miscalculate something, they don't show up on time for a meeting, and they lose a client, something like that. In some other cases, the syndrome is actually the genesis comes from the boss, who starts to distance themselves from the subordinate for either personal or social reasons that have nothing at all to do with performance. Now, in that situation, I just want to stop there for a quick second. That's really key, because if a manager is distancing themselves for personal or social reasons that has nothing to do with performance, they are absolutely complicit in that situation, wholeheartedly. And the employee really has nothing to do with that at all. And they're being set up to fail without even really knowing about it. Their performance could be top notch. But because we, as managers, can sometimes go into situations with bias, we separate ourselves. We create an in group and an out group, and we associate with the in group. We don't associate with the out group, and the out group ends up becoming part of this set up to fail syndrome. So just wanted to kind of make that note there. So thirdly, what happens is the employee begins to feel it, and the boss increases the supervision. So the employee made a mistake. The boss increases the supervision, gives more instructions, and really starts to, wrangle over courses of action. So where normally the employee may have asked something and the boss replied immediately, now it takes them a little bit longer to reply. So they're starting to kind of draw out their conversations. What happens as a result of that is step number 4. The subordinate responds by beginning to suspect that there's a lack of trust, that they don't have the confidence of their manager anymore. They start to withdraw emotionally from the boss and from the work. They may also fight to change the boss's image. So they start to overcompensate and do things over exaggerated in order to make the boss pay attention to them or make the boss start to like them, right? I mean, does this sound kind of familiar? We've all probably been in this situation before. The 5th thing that happens in this syndrome is the boss interprets the problem hoarding and overreaching as signs that the subordinate is using poor judgment, that they really don't know what they're doing, they have weak capabilities. And if they do perform well, the boss then says, well, that was just kind of a one-off win. So, I mean, this is not typical of their performance, or this is not typical of their capabilities. It just happened to be a lucky shot that they made, right? Then he or she starts to limit the subordinate's discretion. They don't let them make decisions anymore. They start to withhold more social contact. And they show lack of confidence and frustration with the employee. Number 6, now this is where last month we were talking about disengagement and falling out of love with your job as an employee, and why do employees fall out of love? This is clearly one of those reasons, because at step number 6, now you have a disengaged employee. Okay. The subordinate now feels like the employee feels like they are boxed in, that they're under pressure, that they're underappreciated, that they're doing all these extra things. Because remember, we talked about them overreaching and starting to do more things to get the boss's attention, and that doesn't work. And even when they do have a success, it's not acknowledged. So now what starts to happen is the employee starts to disengage. So now they're no longer interested in the work. They're no longer interested in having interactions. They don't participate with the team. They don't engage in activities. And in general, there's a loss of, just devoting time to the job. Like they just don't want to do it anymore. And again, disengagement is extremely expensive. It's cancerous within an organization because other people see it, and it has long-lasting repercussions and effects. So that's at number 6. Number 7, now the boss and the manager is really frustrated and completely convinced that the employee cannot perform their job effectively unless they are intensely overseeing everything that they're doing. So now we're talking about super micromanagement. So there was already kind of a micromanagement happening in like step number 3. Now it's times 10, it's on 100. And so now the managers are making their presence known by, very curt and sharp and short words. They're undermining the employee when they're making decisions or when they are trying to just do the little bit of work that they're doing, because really now they're disengaged, so they're not really interested in doing a whole bunch of work anyway. But the little bit that they are doing, now they're being completely undermined by it. And then I guess you can assume in step number 8, the setup to fail syndrome is now in full effect. And the manager is pressuring the subordinates pressuring them during interaction. So they're asking, why are you not getting this done? What is the problem? They're harping on them, and they're continuing just to kind of hound on them and super micromanage them. And now, for the most part, at this point, the employee is either going to stay and be disengaged and be disgruntled and do God knows what, or they're going to quit. And either way, it's an expense for the employee, it's for the employer and the organization as a whole. There's a cost completely associated with that. So it is really, really key that we as managers and businesses understand that we do play a large role in how well our employees succeed, and if they succeed at all. How is it then that we can combat this type of syndrome from happening? There's a few things that we can do. Number one, we have to stop comparing employees to employees. The reason: everybody comes to the table with a different set of skill sets, with a different educational background, with different values, with different work ethic. None of them are 100% correct. All of them are, they have components that are correct within their own right. Our job as an employer and as a manager is to play on those strengths, find out where the areas of improvement or the weaknesses are, and don't harp on the weaknesses, but find ways to help turn those weaknesses into strengths or balance them across the team. So if somebody is not strong in one area, then we pair them with someone, or we, try to get them something that they need in terms of helping to grow that weakness into a strength. Stop using words like, Sally is less motivated. She's less aggressive. She's not as hands-on. She's passive. Those types of things start to create a bias within ourselves as managers and as employers, and starts to kind of create that divide where we talked about, you have the in group and the out group. So it starts to create that divide. And then next thing you know, we have two sets of employees, ones that we feel are very strong performers, ones that we feel are weak performers, whether we've identified that weakness as a true weakness or we've identified it because we're comparing them to somebody else who may be stronger in a particular area than somebody else. So number one, we're going to stop comparing employees. Number two, we're going to stop with over supervision, micromanaging. What that does is that completely undermines the employee. We hire people to do a job. So until they really show us that they can't do the job, or they tell us, which doesn't happen often, but in some situations they'll say, I'm not able to do this particular thing. Let's hope they're not saying I don't know how to do this job at all, because then they falsely represented themselves and we've been hoodwinked. But if they're saying, there's something in particular I can't do in this particular position, there's a certain aspect of my job that I'm not clear about, let's find them the things that they need to help to get there and not create a divide and not harp on the weakness. Let's not start, as soon as they miss a deadline, all of a sudden now they're a poor performer. Certainly if there's a pattern of things that happen, that's a different situation that we need to address. But someone making a mistake doesn't automatically mean that they are a poor performer. It means that they made a mistake. And I'm pretty sure that we've all made a few mistakes in our career. So those are two really key things that we can start to do. Again, it's a reversible situation, and there are 5 steps to the intervention process. So these first 2 things I gave you are things we're going to stop doing in the event that we are in the situation. Or we're approaching the situation. But when we're in the situation, we've now identified, okay, this is a setup to fail syndrome situation that's occurring here. 5 things. Number one, the manager must create the right context for the conversation. It needs to be non-threatening. It needs to be in a neutral location. And we need to have a conversation about the roles and responsibilities, and we need to encourage open dialogue. One of the things is if you don't address a problem immediately, it festers. What happens when it festers? Somebody is going to bubble up, and somebody's going to blow a top. So we need to make sure that we address the situation head on. It's not a comfortable conversation, but it's more uncomfortable to be walking around on eggshells and having disengaged employees in our workforce. So the manager has to create that situation where they can have the open dialogue. That's one. Number two, we're going to use an intervention process to come to an agreement on the symptoms. So what is it that the manager has identified that they can see that is an issue that may be causing the manager to think twice about the employee's capabilities? Outline what those things are. I noticed that when I ask for reports that they're not complete, or I noticed that when I ask for the monthly report, there are mistakes. Or I noticed that when you engage with team members, you don't contribute as much, or something. Identify whatever those head-on things are so that we can start to have this open dialogue. It could be that the employee doesn't even recognize that they're doing this, that they don't even realize that this is happening. And it may be just a shortcoming that we need to address and call out so that it can be addressed. Number three, determine what may be causing the poor performance and acknowledge the manager's part in the syndrome. So yes, we're going to address the employee directly, but we're also going to recognize what our own biases are. We have a team of very high performers, and we expect that they perform at, level A, and this person is performing at level B minus. We need to say, okay, why is that happening? What have I done to contribute to that, if anything? That doesn't always mean the manager is complicit in it. However, as a manager, your job is to manage and to lead. And so in order to lead, you've got to know where the weakest link is and how to address combating what that weak link is, and try to right the ship in terms of getting them on the right path. Number four, hash out what the objectives and the desired relationship is going to be moving forward. So in other words, what is the treatment for the illness? What is that treatment going to be? So we've now talked about, here's where I identified the problem. These are the symptoms that I've created a safe environment for us to have a conversation. That's one. Two, here's what I'm identifying as the symptoms that I'm seeing. And three, here are some things that I think may be causing the problem. Now, number four, let's talk about how we're going to combat it. And then fifth and lastly is that we agree to communicate more openly. We've talked last year, towards the end of the year, about how feedback is so important and how feedback needs to be ongoing and not just a one-time thing, not just when they make a mistake, not just when it's time for reviews or time to give bonuses, etc. So it is really critical and important that we identify times that we can sit down and have conversations, ongoing, continual conversations with employees to give them feedback so that these types of things can be caught quickly. Because if something, for example, the example, the eight steps of this syndrome that we just went through, there's a whole lot of time that went by that the manager could have called them out and said, and not called out in a negative way, but could have had a conversation, pulled them to the side and said, hey, John, I noticed that when I ask for X, you give it, but it's not given with the, accuracy, or it's not complete, or it looks like, you may not be 100% sure what I'm asking for. So let's sit down and have a conversation about that. Address the problem head on. Most problems can be at least start to work towards a resolution when we identify and address the problem. When we don't address the problem, again, it starts to fester. It makes everybody uncomfortable. The employee doesn't know what they should do, shouldn't do. The manager is distancing themselves in terms of conversation, and the conversations they do have are not productive. They're oversight and micromanagement in nature, and that's not helpful for anyone involved at all. So I thought it was really important to kind of bring this up because, as we start to forge forward through the year in terms of topics, it's really important that we understand that employees that are disengaged are costly, number one. Number two, we want to make sure that we're doing all the things possible to make sure that we're not setting them up to fail. And the best way to combat that is to have open communication, have open dialogue, and have a strategy in place for how you are going to have conversations with employees when you identify weak performance, which could be a one-off, or weak performer who could just need some skill sets that need to be beefed up. Or may just need some guidance, may just need some additional feedback, some additional training, something of that nature to help keep them so that they don't become disengaged and don't end up costing your team and the organization money that could have been saved because they, just weren't, it just wasn't explained to them in a proper manner. All right. So we're going to avoid the setup to fail syndrome at all costs. In the event that we recognize it coming, we're going to take these 5 steps that I went through to have that conversation, to kind of bring everything back. And as a good friend of mine always says, we're going to level set here and make sure that we are doing everything possible to help our employees be successful. They're successful, we're successful, everybody is successful. That's how it needs to work. All right. So that's this month's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. I told you I had 2 very quick announcements that I wanted to share with you. First, next month, I'm excited to let you know that I will be participating in a strategic business intensive on Friday, April the 19th. It's from 8:30 to 4:30 in Greenbelt, Maryland. If you're here in the DMV, we would love to have you. Registration information is right at the bottom of your screen there. And I'm going to be participating with 2 very powerful business owners and women in their own right. I'm excited to be working with them at the Strategic Business Intensive. Miss Lisa Anderson, who is the CFO, virtual CFO and strategic business advisor with Anavo Transformation Solutions, and also Siobhan J. Smith, who is a business attorney with SJS Law Firm based here in DC. So the 3 of us will be at the Strategic Business Intensive on April the 19th. Early bird registration ends on March the 15th, which is just a few days away, a little over a week away. So make sure that you register to get the early bird pricing. Seating is limited and it does usually get full. So please make sure you register. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is that starting this spring, I will be offering corporate HR training. I've got several topics that I'm going to be covering and be doing training for corporate organizations. So if you have training that needs to take place for your employees on site, or other businesses that may be looking to have an HR expert come in and take care of some training needs, please make sure that you contact me. One of the trainings that I will be doing is called #NotMeToo. And this is a segue into next month's podcast, which is for April, will air on April the 4th. April is Sexual Awareness Month. And I thought that it was really important to talk about why we don't report sexual assault in the workplace and the repercussions that it can have, and the things that we need to do in terms of employees and managers alike to help combat sexual assault in the workplace and just in general, but specifically in the workplace. So I'm excited to be bringing the training to you. I think that it is important that we stay as informed as possible, because what we don't know can definitely hurt us and certainly cost our organizations lots of money and render us a poor reputation in the workplace. So we don't want that to happen. So make sure you tune in next month, April the 4th, 9:00 p.m. You can certainly subscribe to the podcast if you have not done so already. That will get the podcast delivered right to your email box on the night that it drops, the first Wednesday of every month at 9 o'clock p.m. Please follow me on social media. I look forward to seeing you next month. Until then, have a great one. Bye-bye.